Grüezi miteinander, ganz herzlich willkommen und einen wunderschönen guten Tag, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, liebe Freunde aus nah und fern. Ich freue mich, dass Sie da sind und ich begrüße Sie zu einer weiteren Sondersendung von Weltwoche Daily, die andere Sicht, unabhängig, kritisch, gut gelaunt. We are in a cheerful mode here on this program, gut gelaunt, aufgezeichnet am Donnerstag, dem 12. September 2024 und die Weltwoche schaut ja, wie der Name schon sagt, auch in die Welt hinaus und wir beschäftigen uns mit der Geopolitik und mit globalen Fragen aus unterschiedlicher Perspektive, eben nicht nur aus einer, wie das leider allzu oft in den Medien der Fall ist. Und ich habe heute das große Glück, I have the great privilege and the luck, einen prominenten Gast zu begrüßen in unserer Sendung. Es ist der frühere Außenminister Ägyptens und auch frühere Botschafter Ägyptens in den Vereinigten Staaten von Amerika, stammt aus einer berühmten Diplomaten- und Politikerfamilie in Ägypten, lebt heute in Kairo und ist Chairman eines Beratungsunternehmens, eines strategischen Beratungsunternehmens Links. So I switch to English now that our guest can understand what I'm saying. I was just introducing you. And I'm greeting you, I say hello and I welcome you in our program, Mr. Nabil Fahmy from Cairo. It's great that you can spend some time with us before you fly back to Cairo, and I hope everything will go right. Great to have you here in the show.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to do anything that relates to Switzerland. My first diplomatic post was in Geneva, and my second daughter was born in Geneva.
Okay.
So we go back family-wise a long way.
And what are your associations with Switzerland? What do you think of when you think about Switzerland?
Well, I'll tell you, most of my period there was in Geneva, UN work, and but I always enjoyed leaving the city as much as it was beautiful and going into, if you want, traditional Switzerland, from the different villages, the different cities. And then I was always charmed by the beauty and energy in Zurich at the same time. Of course, coming from a Middle Eastern country where we do things haphazardly, occasionally and sporadically, there was a culture orientation there, but I think we got well together.
We have a huge debate at the moment in Switzerland about Swiss neutrality. There are people who are saying, "Oh, Switzerland should move closer to NATO. We should work with the Americans against the harbingers of evil in Moscow and in Beijing." And there are others who are saying, "No, we have to stick to neutrality." Probably one remark about Swiss neutrality from your Egyptian perspective.
I don't like the word neutrality if it means passivity, because we are all part of a world community and we need to work together towards that community. You work with your friends and with your foes. So I do see the value of being a little bit distant from both sides. And for that reason, in many arguments, the West or the East resorts to Switzerland. And I can give you the examples. For example, the US-Iranian relationship. Switzerland has been the caretaker and the go-between. And many events, political events, sensitive events, Switzerland was chosen to be the venue because it was considered to be not biased. I mean, I don't like the word neutral, but non-biased. But I encourage you to be more active. I was very, very happy when you joined the UN, even though before that you respected the UN principles even before joining it. So, yes, preserve a distance, but don't be passive.
You're coming from a country with a fantastic, great history. You're a cradle of civilization. Egypt, of course, it's a large country with a huge population. You are a power factor, one can say, in your region. Switzerland is a very small country. What is the contribution from your perspective of smaller countries to the world? What can small countries bring to this jungle of great powers?
First of all, everything is relative. We may be larger than Switzerland, size-wise, population-wise, but there are countries larger than us, size-wise, population-wise. So I never argue that small means fewer rights, because I will be paying a price for that with the larger ones. Secondly, the reality is the larger countries benefit from us in many respects. The fact that you were safe haven, that businesses, community, finance found safe haven was extremely helpful in many different times. And again, as I repeatedly said, I've attended so many very difficult political meetings, always chosen to be in Switzerland. So that's useful. But more so, I think it's important for countries like yours and like mine, because we're not that big, not to allow the larger countries to fall into the syndrome of arrogance of power. They need to understand that there's a world out there that is not them. Let me, without extending too much on the answer, I was ambassador in Japan at one point. I had never lived in Asia before. I visited, but never lived. My second day, I am a very undisciplined, curious person. So I decided to walk the streets of Tokyo, look around, and I suddenly feel I'm strange. And I gained a tremendous respect for that there is parts of the world that we don't know about. And we need to engage them, respect them, understand them. We're not going to all be the same. We have to respect international rules. But ultimately, different cultures will have different priorities. And if you look today, even at the major powers, the biggest powers, they produce globally. Their markets are global. So while they are the highest equity owner in those companies, they actually benefit from the market. So there has to be some sort of return. So again, size is not a limiting factor. You still have equal rights, but you need to direct your value differently. I would not, having been a long-time practitioner, recommend that we decide to go to war with a superpower. But I would never, and I have never, in difficult circumstances, agreed to forego Egyptian rights because the superpower didn't agree with us.
And we have to remind the larger powers, the superpowers, that there are smaller states that also count, which is a moderating factor on the world. Before we talk about the difficult conflicts and the terrible conflicts we have today, I want to have a very short summary about Egypt. Our viewers are probably not so familiar with your country, with what's going on. So if you could give us, in very short terms, a little briefing, or how is Egypt doing at the moment? What's important to know? What's the most important issue right now?
Sure. Let me start with the positive and then equally share the challenges. I think the greatest positive is the population. It is large, a bit too large, but 65% of our population is younger than 30 years old. This provides a tremendous level of energy, creativity, a global mindset, and that's potential, if well invested, allows you to grow exponentially. We will invest in traditional growing tools like infrastructure, roads, communications. But at the end of the day, the exponential jump is in the mindset, in the innovation, and not in the hard assets. The hard assets are imperative. So I argue, and when I look at our youth, they are reasonably well educated. They provide a good, well-priced, well-cost labor force. And I'm a bit older, so when we grew up, we were looking basically at competition with our neighbors, physically, literally, in our neighbors, or at least in the cities we lived in. These kids compete with the world. I mean, I have 3 adult children. They all found their business inclinations on the internet. None of them live in Egypt, but they come to Egypt 2-3 times a year. So again, when I see Egyptians confident enough to compete with anybody around the world, it's a sense of pride and optimism. But we need to provide them with the foundation and the landscape. Now, we have moved from a centralized economic system, highly subsidized system, to an open market system which was not well regulated. So we've had ups and downs. We are trying to meet tremendous development challenges because we're 110 million now, and our largest revenue chains were tourism, maritime trade through the Suez Canal, and remunerations from abroad, from Egyptians abroad. 2 of these, actually all 3, but 2, tourism and maritime trade, have been affected by political instability in our region. So we were hit very, very hard with the Red Sea problems that emanated from the Gaza issue. Tourists who would normally come to Egypt, Jordan, Israel, don't do that trip as much as they were in the past. So this has been difficult.
But you can cope with it.
But yes, and I think there's the last 6 months, we've had a change in government, building on the previous one, but much more, if you want, transparent in that this has to be built by the private sector.
And what's the legacy of this so-called Arab Spring, all these turmoils you had? Is this somehow swallowed? Is this managed? Is this period behind a country like Egypt? Or are there still reverberations of that?
Well, I tell you, many people will tell you it's behind us. I argue no. And it was a difficult period, but it was a result of a big mistake. We had been resistant to incremental change. So when you keep keeping things down, ultimately, there will be a point where it breaks. I think it's much better, and this is what we should be doing now, is manage incremental change, especially with this youth factor. The real factor in 2011 wasn't people like me. It was the youth. They were the ones who went to the street, and they weren't, frankly, going into the street complaining about being Egyptian. They wanted to be better Egyptians. They wanted to participate. It wasn't that they wanted money. They actually wanted to share in how do we build this country. So we need to manage change better than we did before 2011. Again, look, we're 7,000 years old, so we tend to lean on the side of stability, and too much stability ends up in having stagnation, so you have to be careful.
You're mentioning history. What's the importance of this fantastic legacy of history? What kind of role does this history play in the mentality of the Egyptians today?
Well, several things. First of all, it's a great, essential confidence builder. You assume you're Egyptian, therefore you have to be good.
You have survived everything.
You have, again, I mean, I don't want to take too much of your time, but in my negotiations on security issues with our neighbors over the years, they would joke with me that the problem with you Egyptians is your existential threat is a bad day, not you're disappearing. You don't believe you're going to disappear. And the answer is yes, we don't. But we also manage our life on that basis. But again, seriously speaking, it's not now, it should not be for Egyptians about surviving or not surviving. It should be about how do we again make Egyptians the proud leaders of the region. And it isn't by forcing opinion on others. It's about leading by, if you want, by example. That's how we led in the past. We used to be the main source of education in the Middle East, in the Arab Middle East. for generations. So we were the knowledge base. We were the channel into the world was through Alexandria. And again, Egypt has the advantage, people don't know this, but actually we are part of two continents. People think we're only in Africa. We're actually in Africa and Asia. Sinai is part of Asia. We live on two seas, the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. So we don't have the choice of being neutral.
Yeah, and you have been deeply influenced even by European.
Sure.
I mean, Alexandria, Alexander the Great, Caesar was there. I mean, the whole the library of Alexandria was like the brain, the intelligence brain of its time.
Excellent point. I mean, I can give you many examples, and I can tell you, as a former ambassador, when I traveled the world, my easiest tool, the easiest card I could play, that would get me into any door, any country, was culture and history. And I didn't have to introduce myself. I mean, normally you go and say, well, my country has so-and-so. You go into any small school or big university, they know the pyramids and the pharaohs, and then tell us more about the modernity. So there's an advantage there, but there's also, frankly, and I tell this to my own peers, let's be proud of our history and build on that history. Don't use it as an excuse not to move forward. So it's a tremendously positive asset, but one that we need to keep investing.
Not to make false use of it. Now let's talk about the darker side of our world at the moment. What's the biggest problem of the world at the moment?
I think the world order is facing a perfect storm. The system was built on the post-World War II mentality and reality. That reality has changed. The mentality has not. You still see the big powers looking at themselves in terms of zero-sum results. And although for post the Cold War this was thought to be part of history, suddenly it's come up again. Balances of power create spheres of influence, informal spheres of influence. When the balance change, the spheres change. But your counterpart may not like that. So that's my first problem. The major powers are still living based on 70 years ago rather than today, which should be a much more collective approach. They will still be the major powers. They will still be stronger than Switzerland or Egypt. And consequently, they will gain more. I'm not saying we will all be equal. We have equal rights, but we're not going to be equal in wealth or power. But they need to exercise their power in a different fashion than in the past. And I would argue also the concepts are wrong, the reality is wrong today. There's even a debate about what currency we should be using. And of course there's a debate about the UN and the Security Council and all these things. If this has changed incrementally, the same point I was making about Egypt, I'll tell you a quick story. When the UN Charter was being written, we had an Egyptian jurist among the negotiators. And back in San Francisco in the 40s of last century, he suggested, let's have a revision of the Security Council membership and how the UN operates every 25 years, because the international order will change. It wasn't accepted then because, of course, the balance of power was in favor of the victors of the World War. And then people were hesitant to accept change. But take the Security Council as an example. Do you really believe that the permanent five are the strongest five in the world? Do you really believe that they are supporting international peace and security more than anybody else in the world? They've actually used force outside their borders more than anybody else in the world.
So the credibility of this UN Security Council is really is not in the best shape.
Yeah, and I argue, therefore, it's important for us to move on from a balance of power to a balance of interests. you will still have more. But it should be about how do we find.
I mean, if you look at the media in Europe, in Switzerland, in Germany, if you listen to the speeches of the politicians, they would argue, well, we agree the international order is eroding, it's falling apart, and Russia and China are to blame.
Why are they Russia to look, again, let's take Europe as an example. 5 years ago, you Europeans were proud, and I accept that, of arguing that there will never be a war in Europe again. Well, what are we witnessing now? So let's not allow our success to be a tool for the failure in the future. And this is not criticism of Europe. In our region, we've had wars for so many years, it's almost become a daily event. And it's painful because look at the number of people being killed or losing lives or losing their future. So, and we cannot, we live together. I'll give you one Egyptian example. We were among the largest importers of Ukrainian grain as well as Russian grain because we import so much wheat. So even though we were not playing a role in the Ukraine crisis on either side, we were suffering from it. COVID is another example. Everybody suffered from COVID, even though nobody is really to blame for COVID. And a lot of the developing countries initially didn't have the resources for the vaccinations. But but ultimately the developed world understood that if you don't help them there, it's going to come back to you.
So we have to cooperate.
Exactly.
But there is a tendency to build up a new iron curtain. I mean, this is obvious to me. I was in China last week, I was in Kiev before, I was in Moscow before, and I have the impression that, 30 years after the fall of the Iron Curtain, there is a new Iron Curtain emerging. Is this really going to happen, or is this just a temporary outburst of whatever geopolitical tensions, or are we really heading into a new, you could say, bipolar world between the West and the East? This is a bit the picture you get when you're in Europe, when you're listening to the Americans. What are you saying about this?
Well, I'll tell you, I'm not that concerned with bipolar. What concerns me most is more and more different parties look at the solution to be the use of force. Use of force militarily, use of force by way of sanctions, and so on and so forth, rather than on trying to resolve it. Now, if we all go down that road, we will end up with complete chaos, irrespective of who's stronger, America, Russia, or China, because there are a lot of other countries in the world as well. I seriously believe that we are in disorder because we have an absence of wise leaders. The leaders in the online movement, Gandhi, Nasser, and Tito in the past, but also, frankly, leaders in Europe during the Cold War, who were calling for, even in Germany, where we are today, let's find a way. And these were...
Let's talk to each other.
Let's talk to each other. It didn't mean that you have to agree, but it meant that it's better to talk to each other and try to find a solution than risk the consequences. Both sides will suffer. I've traveled in Europe frequently. I go to the US. I agree with you that there is this bipolar tension, Cold War tension. But I tell you, I also go to Moscow. And I talked to my friends there. And I said, look, for me, operations in Ukraine are a violation of international law because you're crossing a border. And I apply the same principle in our region to other regions. So do you guys really support this? I know why you did it. I'm not saying I support it, but I know in your East-West dialogue why. And their answer was, we didn't support it at the beginning. And we didn't want to get into confrontation. But with the West talking about trying to destroy,
dismantle
defeat Russia, now we support it. Because now we feel threatened. It's not about the policy decision on Ukraine. I'm not debating whether this is true or not. I'm just debating that.
That's the perception.
Perception. And again, in dealing with my Western colleagues, they very frequently keep saying, well, Russia is not going to stop in Ukraine.
American generals are saying now that Ukraine is still able to defeat Russia militarily. It should happen. They should kick the Russians out. This is like a dogma, I think. They believe it. Do you believe it? Is that possible? If you talk to Russians, they say it's out of the question. We will never let ourselves be defeated in this situation. They have a totally different approach. In the West, we are still saying Russia can be defeated. Do you believe that is true?
Let me take you a step back. I think the West defeated the Soviet Union economically more than militarily. Mm-hmm. That's where you won the battle. It wasn't there was a Cold War, but there was not an active war. Yes, the Cold War generates resources for the military. I agree with that. But in essence, it was the economy and the social fabric.
They went bankrupt.
Exactly. So the issue today is, if you want to promote your values, and it's probably better to promote them soft power rather than hard power. The Russians,
this being the big mistake of Putin, that he was not able to convince the Ukrainians about Russia. Therefore, they tended more probably to the West. There was Western interference. So the biggest mistake, if I understand you correctly, of Putin would be he neglected soft power and used too much hard power.
I'm actually arguing that I think the West could have used more soft power to convince Russia to become closer to the West.
Oh, okay.
But you're right.
Also,
Frank.
The Russians could have
Of course,
used more. Okay.
Of course. And I was in Russia. I met with President Putin in February 14, before he started to. Now, we did not discuss Ukraine, but you could tell that he was anxious about something. I did not imagine that he was going to go in there. But again, that being said, how do we move out of this?
Yeah, how do we solve this crisis?
We solve this essentially by looking at how can we apply. You need, if you want, a comprehensive plan, which has carrots and sticks. And I say this respectfully to all states. By carrots, I mean incentives. If you back off, well, you have to back off because you're not going to win. That's the first thing. And because international law requires you to do so and so. On the other hand, if you back off, these are the incentives. And if I'm not mistaken, at one point Putin was actually thinking of joining NATO.
He said so.
He said so. So, and if I was a Westerner, I would have invited him in with an open door. But again, I'm not naive. I mean, when you're a 7,000-year-old Egyptian, you're not naive. So I'm not saying that everybody's good and just make an offer. But if the Russians have a tremendous history of defense, will they accept losing? I don't know. And if you put them in a corner, what will they do? But, so I understand why the West doesn't want Russia to win. Where I think you're pushing it is wanting them to lose. And I hear this more and more, and you heard it also more and more. So, again, and if these big guys keep bombing each other, we suffer as well. So I mean, when I was a very young diplomat, reading history books and speeches of different statesmen, they were at a completely different level from what we're seeing now. Frankly, the debate internationally now is
no knowledge of history. Do you think that the peace plan of Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who was is good? He was saying, first we need to have a ceasefire, and then we need to have negotiations. The most important thing in the process of finding peace is first a ceasefire, and then you can talk about carrot and sticks, then you can sort out the situation. Would you agree to that? Because he argued this is the biggest tragedy is that on a daily basis people are dying, and we have to stop this.
In theory, yes. Yeah, in theory and on a humane basis, stop the war and then talk.
Yeah.
But one side will always say stopping the war benefits the other side. So I'm not going to stop because the other side will benefit. So in practice, sometimes you have to change the edge or the leverage and offer the future at the same time. And let me give you an example. Anwar Sadat back in 1973 made several initiatives for peace in the Middle East. Nobody bothered to take him seriously. So he went to war. He crossed the Suez Canal with the publicly announced objective: I'm going to cross to wake people up and negotiate. He didn't say I'm going to cross to liberate all of Sinai. He said I'm going to cross because I want to negotiate. When he crossed, the Americans and the Russians, and also the Israelis, took him seriously. And he didn't make the mistake of saying, okay, now I've crossed, I want to keep going. And then he said that a negotiation was not easy. But his ultimate point was, and this I was told this by former President Weizmann of Israel, he said, you Egyptians, you negotiate in a very bizarre fashion. And he was pleasant. I was laughing. I said, what do you mean? He said, you keep saying the same thing over and over and over and over again. And I said, okay. What do you mean? And he said, Sadat, who was the hero of peace. He would, from day one, he kept saying, I want every inch of my territory. I will negotiate time of withdrawal, how many forces you put here, how many you put here, security arrangements, transparency, all of this is negotiated. But I want peace, and I want all my territory back. And in exchange, the Israelis understood that with Egypt outside of the military equation, they're not going to have an existential threat in the Middle East from their neighbors, if there ever was one. But I mean, this is my point. So that's why Sadat moved, and that's why the Israelis moved then. They did. Neither the Begin or Sadat were naive peaceniks. They were serious people.
It's interesting what you're saying. When I was in Russia, one diplomat told me that this was exactly the plan of President Putin, like you described it now with Sadat. He actually went into Ukraine in order to shock the government into negotiations. And he somehow didn't calculate that they would build up this kind of counter force. But at the beginning, he was successful. I mean, they started to negotiate in Istanbul. Now, you gave the key word. We have to switch to another very difficult situation. President Sadat, I mean, I knew him in my childhood. He was a hero of peace. He won the Peace Nobel Prize together with Menachem Begin. These were statesmen who were able to sit on the table and find a solution. And if you look at the Middle East today, we don't see anything like that. We see this catastrophe unfolding in Gaza. What would you say is the most important thing that has to happen to find a solution, a way out of this terrible thing? I tell you honestly, if I look at the situation in Israel, Gaza, I'm totally desperate. I say, they will never find a solution. It's impossible. They will fight till the end of times. But please bring in a more optimistic view here.
Just one point on Ukraine. I think Putin's mistake at the beginning was he went too far inside Ukraine.
Right.
If
he went to Kiev.
Yeah, if he had remained on the eastern part and negotiated, the tensions would have been less.
And the Russians have been totally incapable of producing their case. And when he was saying we are defeating the Nazis in Kiev, people thought he was becoming crazy. If he had said we are entering because of NATO enlargement, because they are threatening us,
he could have had
Russians,
a better.
they completely failed.
But also, frankly, the West, the Brits in particular, did not want negotiations to start early, and that was a mistake on the Western. But let me take you back to the Middle East. That's where I live. I truly believe we are on the verge of losing our humanity. Watching people killed in those numbers and in that manner. And I'm not talking about combatants included, but I'm not talking combatants, I'm talking about civilians from both sides. And considering that to be normal, that means over a generation, we will get used to killing each other as a way of life, not as a political conflict. And don't forget, violence begets violence.
It will never be forgotten.
And it's not only against the other side. Those who killed Sadat were Islamists. They were Egyptians. They weren't Israelis. Those who killed Rabin were Israelis. They weren't Palestinians. Once you start pushing this extremist, violent trend, it's going to explode in your face. And having followed the Arab-Israeli peace process for so long, I can give you 10 hours of reporting about different violent acts from both sides to the other. But one point which I will never equate, I will not equate an occupier with the occupied. Occupied have a reason to be angry. Occupier does not. He has a responsibility to manage even those he's occupying until the occupation is over, and to manage it according to international law. That's what we're losing now. People, including in the West, and you raise the morality of values and all this stuff, which I support, but you have no credibility. Absolutely no credibility. You really think that the violation of international law by going into Ukraine is different from Israel going into Gaza? You argue that a Ukrainian hospital or power station was attacked, and I regret that. But in Gaza, it's self-defense.
I mean, the double standards, the moral double standards, they are striking.
So, on the one hand, as a Middle Easterner, I am worried that we are taking death as natural, violent death as natural, and you're really breeding angry people.
And I'm afraid that the West, you have mentioned it, the West has already lost a lot of its moral credibility. You could even argue those former colonial powers who made so much trouble are now the moral high priests, preaching to the people. But if you look at this, on the one hand, you mentioned it, Ukraine, you could argue that the armies in the Ukraine are much more reluctant to cause civilian casualties, whereas in Gaza we see the absolute opposite, and the same powers who start to criticize Russia for its warfare, they are silent about what's happening in the Middle East.
Not only are we losing our humanity in the Middle East, you are losing us as friends. Because I believe Egypt should have a multitude of partners. I'm not pro-West or pro-East or pro-North or pro-South. That doesn't serve me. What serves me is Egypt. But today, if I go and talk in an Egyptian environment and say the West is successful in doing these things, they say, what, the West? They're a bunch of hypocrites. So you're actually...
hypocrites.
Of course. You're actually losing friends because of the Gaza situation. Not because you support Israel, but because you don't differentiate between supporting Israel and not condemning, not holding them accountable for clear violations of international law. So it's dangerous. And
would you talk of clear war crimes in Gaza?
of
Are
course,
there war crimes?
of course. Look, there are 41,000 at least killed in Gaza. 60% of them are women and children. And I'm talking 41,000 counted, those under them. So when 61,000, 65% are women and children, the number of hospitals that have been attacked, under the Geneva Convention, you cannot attack a hospital under any circumstance. And you cannot argue that you can destroy a refugee camp because you're suspicious that there may be one or two people in there you don't like. This is a culture of inhumanity.
I mean, the Israelis argue, well, you know, the Hamas, the terrorists, they're building tunnels under these civilian infrastructure. They held their own civilian population as hostage. And we always say when we are attacking a region, we say the civilians, please move out,
That's
please
nonsense.
move out.
Just 2 days ago, they attacked a safe zone in Khan Yunis. So they defined it as a safe zone. People went there based on their, and they attacked it. But
I mean, I was astonished that in the Arab world there was not more outrage. I talked to that with our foreign correspondent in Tel Aviv. He said, yeah, that's also surprising. It's a positive surprise. But I mean, you're living in Egypt. You know everybody in the ruling class of Egypt. If your friends start to talk honestly about what's happening in Gaza, what's the mood? How does the Egyptian world, probably also the Arab world, see this?
Sure,
this
it's
tragedy?
an excellent question, but let me just make a point here.
Yeah.
In response to the previous question, the best answer to how we deal with the situation actually came from Ami Ayalon, the former head of Shin Bet in Israel. He was on television recently, and he was asked, what do you do? And his answer was, 2 states. Separate Palestinians from Israelis, 2 states living on each side. And he said, I condemn Hamas. And of course we can reduce the capacity of Hamas. But the real strength of Hamas is not the weapon. It's the cause. And not the cause that they want to be an Islamist version, but the cause that they are occupied. To get rid of the cause, you have to end the occupation. And the journalist asked him, you mean you want to reward terrorism? He said, no, I want to secure Israel. Because if we keep doing this, we will end up. But anyway, your question was...
how, I mean, if you speak honestly, you know, in a private, say, what do the people really think about this? What's the mood?
I'll tell you the mindset. Yes, you're right. The number of demonstrations in the Arab world has been controlled, contained in many respects. The reason is exactly what I'm telling you. Authority in the Arab world is worried about us losing our humanity. And if we lose our humanity and people are angry in the streets, it can get out of hand not only against Israel,
but against your governments too.
But against, because otherwise, look, either you deliver or you respond.
They say to your politicians, you're just watching, you're doing anything, you don't do anything.
And they say, why are you helping with the negotiations? Why are you talking to the Americans? Why do we have peace with Israel? We have peace with Israel. We're talking to the Americans, to the Swiss, to everybody, because we want peace.
And how close are we to an outburst of this negative energy?
Again, another excellent question. I'm worried more about the seeds than how close we are to the outburst.
Okay.
Because if you look at the 41,000 people killed in Gaza, you know how many families, how many people I have seen on television, on Western television, Palestinians saying, my whole family was killed, or the youngest child of a family the youngest child is alive. You think in 15 years he's going to remember Gandhi? He's going to remember that he lost his whole family and he's been living in a refugee camp because of an Israeli bomb. And the vice versa, you will see the reaction from, you will see people in Israel now who
So
think,
it's more of a time bomb than a volcano that will erupt immediately.
And also a false impression inside Israel that force and violence solves your security problem.
But they say, the Israelis say, if I talk to Israeli friends and Israeli politicians and ambassadors in Switzerland, they say, well, of course, we extremely regret, it's a terrible situation, but you have to understand, Hamas forced us into this, what they did, this massacre on the 7th of October, they somehow, they wanted to drag us into this terrible situation. So we are the victims, we have to defend ourselves against these criminals, that's what they're saying. What do you argue? What would you tell an Israeli friend if he argues like that with you?
You have a very short-sighted vision of history. The conflict started 70 years ago, not on October 7th. Mm-hmm. Secondly, your own prime minister supported Hamas. Mm-hmm. Before.
Mr. Netanyahu?
Yeah.
Because he wanted to
split the
sabotage
split the Palestinians. Exactly.
A double state,
exactly.
two-state solution.
Exactly. So your tactical measures that make you think that you've succeeded short term end up exploding in your face medium and long term.
And it's always the same mistake as we did in Afghanistan. They reared the monster Al-Qaeda, which they weaponized
it's the arrogance of power.
Yeah.
And then when a superpower does this, and I've said this to my superpower friends, guys, you can come and make a mistake in the region, then you go home. Mm-hmm. But I live in the region. So you can't come and create a devil and then go and stay in Virginia, or for that matter, in Russia. But again, superpower politics aside, I will never accept Israeli occupation, but I want peace. Mm-hmm. So I'm looking for a compromise.
Two-state solution.
Two-state solution. And it's not a two... You know what? Many of my intellectual friends, they argue that a two-state solution is very difficult. I agree. I said, okay, what's the alternative? And they say one state. Are you serious? You really believe the Israelis and the Palestinians will agree to live together under one flag, not called Israel, not called Palestine, called something else, with equal rights in one territory? You think that's easier than two states? Mm. I mean, how do you expect the Israelis want a Jewish state in Israel? Mm. They're going to give it away, and Palestinians want a Palestinian state in Palestine. Mm. So you really think that's easier to do? I honestly believe, I understand the point. The political environment now is difficult for statesmen to emerge and push this argument. Mm-hmm. But that is exactly why we need the international community to be more respectful and to help.
Yeah, and to guide its credibility by not using double standards, because otherwise you cannot.
You have to apply the law to friend and foe.
Yeah. Now, in the West, it's also argued, and this is the criticism, for example, of Egypt. They say, well, you know, the Arabs are also hypocrites. They're always complaining about the Palestinians, but at the end of the day, they use the Palestinians somehow as a proxy against Israel, and especially Egyptians. They have closed their borders. They don't accept refugees from Palestine, so they are also hypocrites. We are all hypocrites. We are united hypocrites.
It's exactly the,
what are you saying?
It's exactly the opposite. If you look at the Israeli problem, Palestine question, Israeli problem, it's because we're not hypocrites that we're being criticized. We have openly said that on a humanitarian basis, we will accept those who need medical support.
Refugees, yeah.
And we will provide any amount of humanitarian assistance, but we're not going to participate de jure or de facto in Israel's determined effect to reduce the population of Palestine.
To push them out.
Push them out.
And you help this kind of ethnic cleansing.
So you actually want us to
it.
participate in this by threatening us that we're inhuman now.
Okay.
And I can tell you we've had offers, by the way. Numerous offers over the years. Just take them and we'll give you money. We'll give you support. We'll give you access. We haven't done that because at the end of the day, it goes against international law. And if we accept that violation now, it will apply. It will be used against us later by somebody else, somewhere else in the world. So yeah, it's a difficult predicament, and our government is under tremendous pressure. We see people getting killed. We don't want them. We want to stop that. That's why we're hosting the negotiations. At the same time, the Israelis are being very difficult, pushing them towards the border. And we don't accept that they come in large numbers across the border because it is exactly what Israel wants. And the one thing Israel has been consistent in doing, they never let refugees back. So if they were to say, take them and then we'll take them, no, they don't take them back.
So you don't want to be the assistance of a development which you don't like at the end. We could delve into that even more. I would just to bring in another aspect of this whole topic. Europe at the moment, there is a lot of concern about political Islam. We have this horrible crimes in Germany. We saw them in France. It's terrible. You have organizations here. They have come. And this is, of course, also a reason why the Arab world has a very difficult standing in the mood and in the eyes of many Western people. They say, well, leave me alone with Islamic people. They are all fundamentalists anyway. People start to put everybody in the same basket. You have in Egypt also an experience with peaceful Islam, with militant Islam, with the Muslim Brotherhood, with all these difficult developments. What would you suggest the Europeans how to deal with the Islamic world, with the Islamic migrants, and especially what to do about political Islam? What's your suggestion?
Sure. First of all, I'm a practicing Muslim, and I'm proud of it. No hesitation whatsoever. And my comment to Europe would be to grow up.
Grow up.
Grow up. I can give you lists of fringe groups in Europe over the years that have done much more violent activities than political Islam, and I'm not a supporter of political Islam, by the way, if we want to simply analyze it. If you compare the number of times that Western countries have used force outside of their borders, particularly without a Security Council resolution, it's far beyond any other region in the world. And of course, at the top of that list is America.
So you were saying, before you start to criticize political Islam, ask yourself, who has created political Islam?
No.
Somehow, this is, by the way, I think this is a very interesting point. Saying that, of course, political Islam, Islam radicalism is also a reaction to, we saw it in Iraq, to a certain, probably wrong-footed policy.
No,
I'm misunderstanding you?
You're giving me a very easy way out, and I want to be.
No, I thought I was paraphrasing you. I thought I was. Sorry, I misunderstood.
But
you.
it's okay. It's okay.
Yeah.
I'm not going to take that approach because I really want Europe to grow up.
Yeah.
I'm not blaming you for Islam.
Okay.
All I'm saying is, all of our societies have fringe groups.
Yeah.
Some of them are more extreme than others, and I know that many of our neighbors here understand what I'm saying and are worried about rising fringe groups, including violent ones. That's one thing. The world, regrettably, has fringe groups. My second point, I'm not a supporter of political Islam, especially violent Islam, violent political Islam. But they're a fringe group. What do you need to do? What you need to do is basically expand the middle and reduce the fringe. That's even our own countries.
And practically, what would that mean in terms of migration policy?
Well, I'll get to migration. But in terms of help us in our own region become a better region. So you'll get more centrist and less in the fringe. And we will have less in the fringe and more in the center. In the migration, first of all, if we solve our problems, you will get less migration. People, if they find future in their own region, they will immigrate less. Secondly, education. You have to be security conscious, yes. But isolating them in certain areas and they only talk to each other, you end up, it's like throwing a match on oil. So, point one, grow up, be realistic. Everybody has fringe groups, including you. Secondly, okay, how do we deal with that? We deal with that by education, political conflict resolution, social engagement, synergies, all these things. And thirdly, as you do that, while respecting the law, you have to be security conscious.
I bring up a very provocative point. I mean, if we talked about the Iraq War, the second Iraq War, which was somehow the birth hour of ISIS, and now we see the war in Gaza. Many of these violent attackers and terrorists in Europe say this is a reaction to the war in Gaza. Is the war in Gaza producing terrorists on a large scale because of the kind of warfare that is used here, the violation of human rights of private citizens? Is this somehow, you could say, a production line of terrorists, producing terrorists also who could attack the West? They could attack Germany because Germany is on the side of Israel. I mean, is that also, and I think this is an aspect of it. I mean, that these wars radicalize people in the Arab world.
Well, let me put it this way. A lot of wars around the world, for example, Afghanistan is not Arab. Many of you in Europe argue, but it's not Arab. And the Taliban has no relation with the Arab world per se. Qaeda was the antithesis of Islam. It used the banner, but these are all reactions to social functions.
But also to interventions of the West?
That's added to it. I mean, what is the social function? If it's something where, I mean, I'm not blaming the West for the Muslim Brotherhood because it came out of Egypt historically, different period of time. So it would be historically incorrect to say you created it. But a lot of people in the Middle East believe that, yes, you were instrumental in Al-Qaeda and you were instrumental in Taliban. I would tell you a quick story. When the Soviets were in Afghanistan, to counter the Soviets, the Americans actually supported the Taliban and supported Islamists. So you were fueling that in Afghanistan.
So we're probably not creating it, but we were enabling it and fueling it.
And I can tell you, you were actually doing that historically. It's public. Trying to get support from Egypt and Saudi. And then the first two countries attacked by Islamists after Afghanistan were Egypt and Saudi. So it shows you also that you played this game. But I'm not blaming you for the creation. We have to be wise in dealing with it. You have to be wise. Stop trying to blame each other and let's move to...
And your point is, in order to prevent this radical Islamism, we should also cooperate, of course, with Arab countries in order to create a larger center to kind of push out the fringes. I come to my final point here. I mean, the peace in the Middle East, I mean, there is a lot of desperation there. I mean, one can argue, you know, since the Bible, we see the conflict between the people of Israel and the Islamic or the Arab people. It's already written in the old scriptures, etc. You have witnessed in your whole life. You have witnessed this tension, this conflict. You have seen great statesmen come and go and be assassinated. I mean, what's the beam of light? What makes you hopeful that there could be final peace between, you know, Israel and, I mean, the Arab world? Where's the hope? Where's the beam of light?
Okay. Again, just to 2 points. You had asked me about whether Gaza would create more terrorists. It's creating more terrorists.
I think so.
It's creating. to answer that question, you need to look at it in 20 years. Secondly, everybody's freedom fighter is somebody else's terrorist. Even Menachem Begin was on the terrorist list of several countries. So let's solve the problem rather than trying to solve the result of the problem. But to go to your point.
Beam of light.
Beam of light.
Silver lining.
You know, I actually consider not social media, but the connectivity as a tool that we can use to create. I think the beam of light is youth. If you talk to most of the youth in the Arab world today, and you correctly mentioned that there are fewer demonstrations than in the West, they actually want a future. They don't want a war. They're angry. And if they were left to demonstrate, they would demonstrate more. But in actual fact, they're not arguing with their governments yet because they don't want war with Israel. They want peace. The real problem is not the Arab world back in 2002. The Arab Summit in 2002, that's 22 years ago, upon a proposal by Saudi Arabia, among the most conservative countries in the region. All the Arab world accepted that if Israel ends its occupation, we will have normal relations with Israel. 22 years ago. And weak leaders in Israel and in America ignored that initiative. Now, the Israelis are arguing, well, we want relations with the Saudis. It's all a tool. The Israelis, the present Israeli government, with the present Israeli Prime Minister, does not want a reduction of tensions because it will create accountability issues for him that are long-term.
So the positive aspect is youth, connectivity, the possibility to connect, to
give
cooperate.
People hope. You know, we actually need to imbue hope.
No.
Give them hope, and you will see a tremendous creativity and cooperation even among Israeli youth and Palestinians.
And your personal perspective on the world? We have a lot of wars, a lot of tension, but there is also the perspective of a multipolar world, of a multifaceted world with a variety of interesting states, bigger ones, smaller ones. Are you optimistic about the future or are you pessimistic?
I'll hold my breath a little bit, but I look at the West with all of my complaints about the West, and I see Westerners demonstrating in the streets against Ukraine, against Russia and Ukraine, and against Israel in Gaza. In the West, they're demonstrating. I go in our parts of the world with all of our complaints about the West, and you see the number of people waiting on the sidewalk to get visas to go to the West. And now to go to the East. The East is opening up. So I actually believe more and more of the generation of my children, more and more are looking eastwards.
So the will to cooperate is bigger than the will to
and
fight.
And the understanding that opportunity is there.
Yeah.
We didn't know that when we were growing up. These kids, these young kids is the wrong word, these young people understand. There's opportunity in Japan, in China, in Taiwan, anywhere, and there's opportunity in the West. There's opportunity in Africa, by the way. And therefore, they want to understand. They don't want to fight a war, but you can't ask them to be hypocrites.
No.
It just doesn't fly.
Mr. Foreign Minister, thank you very much for this conversation. Meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, wir haben viele Themen angesprochen heute, aber ich glaube, es ist auch gelungen, in einige dieser ganz schwierigen Geländekammern hier einzusteigen. Ich möchte Ihnen ganz herzlich danken. I thank you very much for this in-depth conversation. Und wir verabschieden uns mit diesem versöhnlichen Ausblick, wünschen Ihnen einen guten Tag und freuen uns, wenn Sie dabei bleiben. Abonnieren Sie diesen Kanal, abonnieren Sie die Weltwoche. Und wenn es Ihnen gefallen hat, dann geben Sie das zum Ausdruck durch einen Kommentar oder wenigstens einen Daumen hoch. Merci vielmals and we wish you all the best for the future. A safe return and we say goodbye for the time, but we will be back.